every button I've hit in Zoom,
All
the
right, so we
messages are
are.
still on my screen,
Gotcha. We're
but it's
recording.
working on Facebook, so I'm just not going to touch anything.
Perfect. And so we're recording, then I'll load it up and get it to you afterward.
Excellent.
Perfect.
All right. So, ladies, gentlemen, all our non-binary friends, guess what?
Cosmic and otherwise.
Oh, yes, at this campfire, this cosmic campfire, we have Andrew M. Davis. He's an editor. That's how he gets his name on the front. And and having spent some time with Phil and myself, I know that this book is not just some weird project your dissertation advisor got you in on, but something
Quite the
you.
opposite, in fact.
Yeah, it goes the other way around.
Right. That's right.
All right, so what I'm hoping we can do is, one, to let everyone get to know you, where the book came from, your own story. Then we got some nerd words and concepts and stuff that come up in the book we're going to talk about.
I love
And we got
nerd words.
questions and things.
Perfect.
So I think the best place to start, judging from all the get to meet yous in the group, knowing quite a few of the people just from all the previous homebrew groups,
Sure.
I know a lot of people did grow up in a similar situation to you. So when we start talking about coming back to God, so often that's shaped by where you begin. So
Absolutely.
where did Andrew Davis begin his spiritual journeying?
Where did I begin? The womb. And then I found out I'm in the womb of God. Well, that's a great question. And let me just say how awesome it is to be a part of the group here too. I see this group as an exemplification in a deep sense of what this book is and what it aims to do, namely bring different diverse journeys together so that they can collide in some sense and spur something new. It's like the particle accelerator that you fly particles together, they explode, and then something new is discovered, right? So mutually enhanced. That's been the idea.
It's like the Facebook group for the Higgs boson. Like,
yeah,
we're the collision that is the God particle.
Oh my, yes, theological particle collider. So right, that's a great question for me. So let me start with two distinctions from my mother's side and my father's side then. My mother was a conservative evangelical, I would say, even if a bit rebellious at times, but very committed, very faithful, and pretty conservative in the traditional ways we begin to think about evangelicalism. And certainly evangelicalism is a diverse phenomenon as well. So she raised me with faith, with commitment, with hope, and these are things that I hold to even today, although in different nuanced ways. My father, I would say, was raised Catholic. He swooped into the evangelical world for a number of years and then swooped right out again into a more agnostic position, leaning towards atheism, proclaiming Darwinism and science, really had a death blow to traditional sort of thinking. So I came up in between both of these, appreciating the value of faith and commitment on the one hand, but also the skepticism involved in intellectual inquiry on the other. And so my upbringing was very much a traditional evangelical upbringing. I was in elementary school and high school at very classic, we might say, evangelical schools. Okay, and what does that mean? It's sort of an interesting question. So what are some of the topics for me that in that world I largely took for granted, and we do this a lot. We take for granted the environment we're in until we realize that, oh goodness, there's a whole other way of viewing the world.
Well, and I think that's an important thing to pause on. Like,
Sure.
a lot of individuals who are processing especially the more painful parts of their religious past, or those things that they're embarrassed about. Like, I know before this you talked about like the purity culture around sex, or
Sure.
obsessed with heaven and hell and the end times and demons and things like that. One of the things I really liked earlier today that Mike Morrell talked about was how a lot of those images and texts and things come back and you embrace them in a different way.
Sure.
And one of the gifts of a group like this, and really a number of the spiritual memoirs that are there, are the ways you see, like, through the journey and difficulty of kind of deconstructing and going through the different criticisms that it's really helpful to see people that have a new relationship with their place of origin, where
Sure.
they can reclaim in different ways those things. And I'm thinking just like to the opening of the John Cobb chapter or whatever, where you're
Oh,
like,
totally.
you
Totally.
know, and to me that's is a goal.
Right. So you're not quite there yet, but it is a
Yeah.
well, that's funny you say that though, and maybe we'll get into this later. But so again, I'm out of evangelical high school, 7th and 8th grade, junior high. I would return to this school as a teacher, in fact. So this is an interesting way of sort of returning to God after God, right, in a way. We'll get to that. But so again, like, what are the key issues? And I think we'll see some resonance between my story and the Mike story, and perhaps your story too, Tripp. Right, heaven and hell were really big. You wanted to go to heaven, you wanted to avoid hell. Like, this was important, and it seems natural. I recall in particular being in 7th grade, a chapel service. Pastor Graves, he must have been in his 80s, and he got to the topic of hell, and he got silent, and he leaned in and asked us if we'd ever burned ourselves on a stove. And we're thinking, well, we did. That was not fun. And he got silent up to the mic, and he said, well, that's what hell's going to be like, but all over your body. And I remember even then being inquisitive, leaning to my friend Mario and saying, that's bullshit. Like it's an interesting preoccupation again with destiny. And we might wrap back around and understand that differently. I think that's probably important. I think to keep a part of your worldview in some sense. But that would be one thing. Another thing would be, okay, the Bible. The Bible is the literal word of God. It was dictated by God. Therefore, if you had questions of cosmology, questions of science, questions of any number of topics, your first point of reference was the Bible. So Genesis, again, for example, seemed to give us, at least in our young minds, a very young cosmos. Right? The old earthers were rather rebellious in nature. We knew we had it right. Right? Evolution. Okay, here's another one. It wasn't God and evolution. It wasn't creation through evolution. It was creation versus evolution. Right? So that these were contrasting opposites. And if you held one, you couldn't hold the other. Right? You affirmed one, you couldn't affirm the other. Okay, another one was sexual purity. Okay, an important topic. Certainly, you were to remain pure. God seemed to be interested in what you were doing with your bits and pieces. Okay, and I don't mean to offend anyone. Oh, and you don't want to choose to be gay, because that would be a bad thing. Right? This is something God frowns upon as well. Okay, what else? End times. Okay, the end of the world was nigh in some sense. I didn't exactly accept a rapture sort of approach, largely because my mother thought that was a bit silly. But again, 9/11 happened, and that was a bad thing. And there was wars and rumors of wars, and things seemed to be going on. And once the world ended, we know we were going somewhere else. Or at least that was the impression. Okay, and associated with that too, I'd say central was the question of the demonic, the question of Satan, the nuanced ways these realities were acting, if only through Pokemon and Harry Potter, right? So some of you might relate to that. Now, I had a great time in high school. I really did. I made long-lasting friends. I played basketball. I largely took for granted a lot of these sort of interesting ideas. But when you think about it, they do produce a certain image of God. That image for me, to the extent that I had it and understood it, was kind of a finger-shaking God. This was a monarchical God. It wasn't where we were. Therefore, the part of the religious orientation, it seemed, was to get to where God was, and God was in heaven. Well, actually, this was one of the questions that someone raised earlier on the Facebook group a few days ago. Where is God's locus? Well, it wasn't here. It was somewhere else, and so that changes our sort of orientation. So I largely took those things for granted, though. And I'd say that as I moved out of high school, I always had a sort of cosmic interest. My friends and I, we'd go and we'd smoke cigars up at Rocky Point. We'd look at the view, and I remember raising questions about the stars. But like Kant says, the stars above, the moral law within, like, what's going on? What are we participating in? That always sort of baffled me. A lot of the ideas from my upbringing seemed to be detached in some way. I was interested with, I'm baffled I'm even here. What does that mean? I didn't seem to choose to be here. All of a sudden I woke up in a world, like, that's interesting. Like, that's philosophically interesting. So I will say, though, and we'll see this in a number of books. And Tripp, do you want to jump in at all, or do you want me to?
Well, no, I was just thinking that, and this came up earlier in someone's post that, one of the challenges as you start to tell your story and start to read these other stories is realizing that, things that could have felt like a burden or shallow at one point, like, can mean something different as you start to process them and look back.
Sure.
And that's something that happens really quickly, I think, in adolescence, where, you receive these narratives, these rhythms and stuff, and it's really the only world is the one everyone around you has, right?
Sure.
And so you talk about, like, your dad had this distancing period, but this is what your family did, right? And then you go to a Christian school, and that's what you do there.
Right.
And so in some sense, like, as you start to get more critical, you also have to remember, like, no one picks who their parents are, what world they're in, what race, gender, class, all that kind of stuff. They're just kind of given. And those are the ingredients that make all the beautiful things that happen in your life and the ugly ones. And so it's normal to wrestle with it, leave it behind, and seize things for yourself. And I wonder what you talk about, sitting on the top of a, hill, smoking cigars, talking with your friends, which is a very, like, college thing to do.
Well, I was in high school.
Yeah. Well, in California, that's dangerous. In my family, we're from North Carolina, so when you turn 16, you get to smoke a pipe and cigar on the porch and argue about religion and politics.
Fantastic.
And California, true story. I'm sure this is really important to Cosmic Campfire. I got a parent when I first started as youth minister, when I moved to California, told me she was uncomfortable with some of the pictures I had of our senior minister, my father, and I smoking cigars when my dad came to visit. Same parent. Sweet. I went to visit them for dinner, asks if I want to roll with the mom and the dad after dinner. So they're like, no tobacco use on your Facebook. That's bad influence on the kids. But we could go on the back porch now that dinner's over and smoke up. And I'm like, this is not North Carolina.
No,
but so for you, was there an experience? Was there a pain? Was there a question? Like, what was the first thing that shook the world you were handed, where you realized this isn't the only option? These aren't, like, my givens aren't required.
Totally. Yeah. And that's such a pivotal question. As we go through the book, we see that too. Like, so the way I frame it and think about it is in terms of dark nights of the soul, right? These modes of being or phases of life that are not exterior to one's path, but intimately wedded to it. So for me, again, I took a lot of these things I mentioned early on for granted. I didn't really think through them. I liked Bible class, even though I'd push back and was a little skeptical. I always thought hell was interesting, like speaking in tongues, like the Mike's named glossolalia. I'm like, what'd you call me? I thought that was interesting as well. I would go deeper though, right? So I wasn't yet a committed, I wouldn't even call myself a fundamentalist, but I would become one. And that's interesting. So what's the painful experience or the difficult experience? For me, it's something I say it was I think the worst thing that happened, but also the best thing. Okay. And this was a time of being sick. Okay. We'll see different modes of this emerge from this book as well. We call it the problem of evil in some way, or difficult spiritual transitions. So for me, I must have been 19. I was spending a year at a JC in Santa Rosa. That's my hometown, Northern California. And I had a lot of very odd symptoms. My tongue would go numb. I'd have these weird flushes through my body. An overall general sense of just not feeling well. And after 9 months of searching for answers, doctors, looking for some sort of remedy, I began obviously researching my own symptoms. Just as a heads up to most of you out there, it's usually not a very good idea. Okay? You end up sort of scaring the hell out of yourself, or the hell into you. I mean, who knows? So, but what I did is begin researching these symptoms and became depressed, because my conclusion was, and it seems hilarious at the time, but at the moment it wasn't, I convinced myself utterly that I had a brain tumor. Okay, and that's again, it seems hilarious, but at the time it wasn't. It was like, my God, out of all the people, in this cosmos, Andrew Davis has a brain tumor. And beyond that, even, I became content with the idea I became even okay with the idea that my life would end, you know? And that's an interesting existential place to be in. But what happened through this time is I began to raise the fundamental questions of life. Like, what the hell are we doing here anyway? What's the purpose of all this? How best should I live? If there is a God, what is this God like? What is Christianity, something that should be kept in my life or tossed out? What I began to do through this time is actually start reading the New Testament. And things would jump out at me, truths of wisdom, of orienting my life in a different way. I wouldn't say I was carelessly living, but this sickness gave me an opportunity to pause and ask about my life. So what did it end up being? In the long run, a blood test would finally come back and say it's a rare form of mono. So it wasn't a brain tumor, it was mono. But what that experience for me was, it was not insignificant, because it was like, here's your life back. You are now sort of at the jaws of death, presumably, and now you've given your life back. And the question for me was, okay, how best do I live now?
Mm-hmm.
What do I orient my life around now? Okay, so the next year.
And this is the beginning of college?
That's right. The next year was my first year at Point Loma Nazarene University. Perhaps there's alumni out there. Again, an awesome experience, but my first year at Point Loma was a year of fundamentalism. I dove in, and I dove in hard. So I'd say all the things that I mentioned of my high school upbringing, I dove into and I accepted as fact. And I will say, without reading much, without, investigating too much. I've been given my life back, and I wanted to commit myself in a way that I hadn't before. So I joined a prayer group. We met in the upper room, quote unquote, of the cafeteria. Okay, and this was a charismatic group, good people. We hollered and hooted and we prayed, and there claimed to be healings going on, right? So this is the type of environment I was in for a year. I remember interesting adventures that I'd sparked. Okay, one of them was, for example, going down to the psychic palm reader building on Rosecrans Avenue down in Point Loma and tossing Bibles up onto the roof. Right? It's like, what is this going to do? Like cave in or something?
It's like a Striper concert.
Right. Yeah. But the Bible had power, you see, like that. The Bible had power. It was something that you could wage war with. That sounds wild now, but spiritual warfare was very much a part of this initial year for me. The Bible was literal. Satan and hell and demons was literal, and you better get it right, because your life is at stake and your destiny is at stake.
Something that strikes me about that, and this is I had to learn painfully, but when I was a campus minister, working with college students, like the number of people that would tell me some experience similar to yours, right? Like, yeah. I thought I had brain cancer, blah, 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 blah. It was just mono. And so the Lord's giving me my life back, and then you have to ask them, like, did you stumble when you received mono? Because, that's it.
You mean roll my ankle? Well, maybe.
Yeah. But when I was a campus minister, hearing people tell those stories, like, you don't really get to pick what happens to you. You do get to decide what you do with it. But I think when it goes to those moments that sends you into deep transition, yeah, it's too tempting for us to judge them based on was the pain as big as mine? Was the fear as big as mine? Was the joy as deep as mine, or whatever? And realize that, like, whatever is deep for one person is deep for that person. And it probably is experience similar to yours, even if your experience was deeper, more. Because mine had to do with losing multiple family members and friends to cancer in a year period. And then my mom getting stage 4 cancer, and then taking care of my grandmother. She slowly died of cancer, and like this whole suffering thing. And then I read, because I put off reading a book, Night by Elie Wiesel.
Oh yeah. At
2 a.m.
Somewhere up here.
And which is a horrible thing to do when you're already depressed and angry at God. And I remember thinking to myself later, like, how many times before going through that experience where you're like, I could have minimized my own experience, except it was mine, and gone like, there's actually nothing wrong with you. your grandmother's had a long, beautiful life. Like, you're going to figure out the best treatments for this and all that kind of stuff. And you could have like rationalized or explained it. But to me, there's something about those, like when someone shares a story or their experience they're going through, and it's one of those transition things, just to honor it as a liminal space and be grateful they shared it with you, as opposed to try to explain it away. Because what was going on, and you hear this in your story and so many of the memoirs we hear, and some of the people in the group I know, like what's going on beneath the surface of whatever sends us into those questions, doubts, wrestlings, and things is so much bigger. And if we just pretend like the only issue is what's happening that they're externalizing, we miss joining people in those holy transitions that can take place. And sometimes we help them build up walls to even resist what's possible in them, because we're their leader or their friend or their parent. And we're like, that's really not that big a deal.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a beautiful way of speaking about what this book is about in some sense, right? That, to quote John Cobb's subtitle of his book, a mutual transformation, right? It's not Buddhism and Christianity in our case, certainly. It's a great book, and by the way, for anybody it's called Beyond Dialogue, A Mutual Transformation of Buddhism and Christianity. So my point would be is that when journeys collide, like we're saying, there can be a mutual transformation, right? So what somebody else discovered, what somebody else went through can help inaugurate your own life and your own journey in a different way. It may be the people they've read, the intellectual sort of inclinations. For example, a really interesting, I think I mentioned this before, a really interesting exercise, I think, for anybody to do would be to pick one book that's mentioned in each chapter that helped influence these different leaders' journeys. I certainly mentioned a lot in my conclusion, and then read all 10 or 12 of them in the next year and see how you come to see things differently. So, I mean, yeah, certainly journeys collide, and sharing those difficult times is important. And I certainly see that in this book, and it might be something to pay attention to as we move forward, these sort of dark nights. So, but you also mentioned transitions. So if I step back think about my journey again, what were the transitions that began to dig me out, in a sense, of the fundamentalist world? First year at Point Loma, I mean, I dove in hard, and I wanted to know the truth, but I had a pompous attitude about it. If I look back, I was walking around like I knew something that you don't, and look at you going to parties on the weekends, even though I enjoyed a few beers always. Don't you know
that doesn't count as fundamentalism. I just want you to know, like, you have to eliminate all good things from your life.
Oh dear.
Like, and how many DC Talk CDs did you have?
Jesus Freak or Audio Adrenaline. Believe me, I was a metalhead since 7th grade. So I didn't exclusively listen to, just Christian music.
Okay, so if you're in the car and you're driving down the road and you're going between LA and San Diego and you get to that long place where there's not much there, and you're going to crank something and it's going to be shredalicious. It's like where you're going to sing in falsetto the guitar solo. So when it gets there, you're like,
oh yeah, sure.
Like, what's that song for you?
Oh, I know that right offhand. Now, many, of course. It would be a Metallica, okay? And the song would be One.
Oh.
It has, you may know it, it is a ripping guitar solo, and it makes me agree with Marjorie Suhaki when she says music is the truest theology.
Well, you know what my favorite Marjorie Suhaki quote is?
What's that?
Once you come to truly understand that God shares everything with us and we share all things in God, then after a high-quality love-making session, you tell God, you're welcome.
Oh, my God.
I couldn't tell if she was joking or not, but there's no follow-up to that.
I'm trying to imagine her say that.
Well, I got it on tape.
Oh, you do? Okay. Well, and of course, on the sexual issue, of course, Cobb, this is an issue for Cobb. We'll come to see that as the group continues. Question of sexuality. I mean, metal is just one facet. I think all genres of music offer something, and they offer something spiritually significant, I would say, to be honest. I think each genre of music offers a mode of feeling, because that's what music is about. For me, it's a mode of feeling the world differently. And if on these conceptions of a panentheistic notion, the world is a mutually effective, related, feeling cosmos, that's significant. So But let me just backstep really quick. So what dug me out of this fundamentalist mode? Traveling did, reading did. So in 2008, I joined a group that went to Kathmandu, Nepal, for nearly a month, and I was excited and geared up to do things for Jesus. You know, I was a part of a group that wanted to at least, you know, prior at school, that wanted to heal people. I mean, Jesus said, "You do greater things than me." It's like, okay, if we believe what this says, then damn it, we ought to do it. Okay, Nepal blew a hole in my worldview. At least it began to. Why? Because I realized how vast the cosmos was, how utterly diverse it was, how the problem of evil has no simple solution. Okay, one example I will never forget is a beggar on the streets, no arms, no legs, and a pot next to him, and he's begging. And I remember it's burned into my memory and thinking, how do I begin to square this with what I've been given, with the enthusiasm with which I've come here to help the world, presumably. Okay, Nepal was one. When I returned back to school, I began reading seriously. I declared myself as a philosophy theology major. I started, getting into biblical studies, gospel study, theology more. Okay, and that began to help my thinking in different ways. Some of you may be familiar with Semester at Sea, which is a study abroad program. At the time, it was run through the University of Virginia. You live on a ship with 700 or 800 other students, and the world is literally your campus. I was really fortunate to be able to literally embark upon this. We visited 15 different countries, even more cities, and this blew my world apart because I was in synagogues, mosques, temples all over the world. I was talking with people from all different varieties of traditions. And I began to question further. I was reading books. I wanted to share it with you guys. Where is it? My dad gave it to me. You'll remember this one, Tripp. The Meaning of Jesus. Okay.
Oh, I remember that.
Marcus Borg, N.T. Wright, and Borg's more progressive understanding of things began to seem appealing to me.
Just to clarify,
yeah,
most people don't read that book and go, in Borg's
sure.
The N.T. Wright, Marcus Borg things, here I have this weird rule where you go, if N.T. Wright and Marcus Borg agree, then that's a solid conclusion for historical Jesus stuff.
Sure.
Because
yeah. I don't mean to dismiss N.T. Wright. I like N.T. Wright a lot. What happened is Borg gave me a different way of understanding. I faced the question of that Christian faith, at least my Christian faith, was rather small. It was one but many sort of paradigms of understanding one's place in the world. I became interested in science upon returning that too, the science-religion discussion. I remember peppering John Polkinghorne with questions. He came to give lectures at Point Loma. One of my questions was, Dr. Polkinghorne, for 2 billion years, bacteria reigned in the cosmos. How do we make sense of divine providence now? Okay, I mean, this is a great question. This is a wilder understanding of God. It must be, or on an evolutionary model. I mean, what the heck's a T-Rex anyway? That's an interesting animal. It's an interesting. These are interesting questions, and I started to have my mind exploded, and that's what traveling will do. It takes a narrow frame and bursts it open, and this is why I love Augustine's quote. Right, you've heard me say it before. The world is a book, and those who don't travel read only a page. It's like, okay, here's the book. It's like reading How I Found God, skimming the table of contents and then shutting it and putting it down and saying, well, that's it. But in fact, you've never even begun to read it. So traveling for me started to burst my categories. It awakened to me a cosmic, global sense. And I faced the question, what sort of worldview can I develop now?
So I have a question for you.
Sure.
Because I want to make sure we get to all the nerdy stuff. And
totally,
if I'm sitting here and reading comments and going, I want to know how in the world the story up to this point leads to someone editing a book titled How I Found God in Everyone and Everywhere with at least 4 world religions on there. And half the people that are in a religion, people know. Most of the people in that religious tradition aren't sure they belong.
Yeah.
Even though they're sure they belong in God. So, give us the outline of it. And I think then it might be fun to biographically share how he came to certain conclusions that kind of framed the book and things.
Totally. Yeah. Okay. So,
and the ability for me to stay quiet while you talk about your love for Whitehead will just not exist. So I don't want to try to just listen there. It's not a
fair enough. We can go back and forth on that.
Yeah.
I graduated Point Loma and began a master's degree in Claremont in interreligious studies, because I've always been interested in the fact that we live in a very pluralistic world. I was familiar with the fact that this presents certain problems, certainly, to those worldviews that are espousing a very exclusivistic mentality. By the end of my college tenure, I was more of a progressive, liberal sort of Christian. I discovered Whitehead. I discovered a panentheistic scheme when I entered my MA program in Claremont. Okay? I took ministry and the problem of evil. Problem of evil was difficult for me. I saw a lot of difficult things, wondering how to square them with a God that presumably could stop them and had the benevolent nature to do so, but nevertheless didn't. So I began deepening my understanding, right? And I wasn't philosophically grounded at that time. After college, entering Claremont, I began to see that what I needed was a philosophical backdrop. Okay, like, this is the fascinating thing. Like, religions don't necessarily tell you how the world works. You know, it's certainly the Semitic religions, in a sense, they are focused on key and pivotal moments of history that we live in light of, but they don't give you a metaphysics. Like, Whitehead has a great line where he says, in Religion in the Making, Buddhism, say, is a metaphysics generating a religion, and Christianity is a religion looking for a metaphysics. You know? So
and what did he just spend in front of that chapter talking about? That the genius of the Christian story is it involves a cross, right? So our story is looking for a metaphysics, and it's a metaphysics that has a completely different vision of power, of dominance, of organization, how creativity and life flourishes.
Right.
So I think that's one of his most brilliant insights, is that Christianity.
Yeah, and I would say
in seeking a story. And when people start telling you that you're doing ontotheology as a process person, that's one of the lines I point at, just because I'm like everything Heidegger talks about in ontotheology is totally not a metaphysic inspired by a cruciform narrative.
Right.
And I just said ontotheology. Sorry for everyone that's not a philosopher. Don't just ignore it. We'll get back to it later.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we'll try to keep some of the language down. So the problem of evil. Again, my interest in sort of science, and the fact that I began to see that actually metaphysics, or the question of what is ultimate, or what is on a general level indispensable for any sort of worldview, was totally important, and that it's here that questions of science emerge from. So process thought, as I discovered it, I began reading Whitehead and David Griffin and John Cobb, who's in the book certainly, Charles Hartshorne. I began to see that there's also a critique offered towards science, right? So I largely took it for granted, say, that science posed an enormous challenge to my struggling Christian faith, right? So to the extent that God is conceived as a being out there somewhere, even in its worst form, with a proper name God, that didn't seem to have any compelling evidence for me in a scientific worldview. And I wondered, is that what the God question is? And, well, I don't think it is. And you'll see if we read through to the final chapter. For me, the beauty of panentheism in a process relational model, even one could say of some classical thought here too, is that the question of God is not so much a question as to whether a being is out there somewhere and whether different arguments will establish the existence of that being. The question is much more one of what is the deepest nature and character of the reality you inhabit. And you don't argue too much whether that exists. I mean, you can be a solipsist. Okay, this is a fascinating position that says essentially I am the only one that exists. But it's a question about the deepest nature of reality, and clearly that exists. And you wonder how best to name its nature. One of the best quotes Ward gives in this book, Keith Ward that is that God is the deepest nature, and I forget how he frames it, the deepest nature of the cosmos itself. So that we're not talking about exterior type of interventions or exterior type of relations per se, but something we're already caught up within. Okay, to use Paul's frame in Acts, quoting the pagan poet, okay, in whom we live and move and have our being. This is the type of vision that process thought began to give me. I began to see the significance of this for evolution, for cosmology, for religion, for pluralism. It began to address issues that for me were very problematic. That God's power was not omnipotent and coercive, but luring, evocative, compelling. Okay, so all of these ideas undergird my transition towards a panentheistic view. I can't say I ever embraced atheism per se. I even think there's a wisdom in atheism, certainly to a certain extent, that it's rejecting what should be rejected in a certain way. I love the new atheist conversations as much as I think they're philosophically impoverished. So I began to develop the idea for this book a couple years ago. You want to jump in?
No. I was just giggling. Before you got to Claremont is when we had the visit from Dan Dennett, who's one of the new atheists.
Sure.
And
Phil debated him, in fact, right here in Claremont. Was that the one?
Oh yeah, because I talked him into posting a video on YouTube that I went and shared on New Atheist Reddit, and then they all got so worked up about it that he had to do it or whatever. And the funniest part, like if you watch the debate, like Phil and him are trying, like he's trying to talk to him, and Dennett is used to debating and going, for the crowd,
right?
And Phil's like, no, I don't think you understand. I'm asking, and he's trying to ask, like, at what level of complexity does causality cease to move downward whatsoever? Right. And then, Dennett's like, I'm sorry. Like that. So then Phil's like, well, what about this experiment? What about this experiment? What about this experiment? And he's like, no. Would just make these like basically like high quality religious jokes. Like they were hilarious.
Sure.
Phil was trying to figure out.
Dan Dennett's very witty. He and Ford just had an interesting discussion on YouTube. I forget the.
Oh yeah, that was funny.
Justin Brewerly.
Yeah, because Keith and him are both funny.
They're hilarious.
Both smitten with their position, which I'm sure they both walked away going, y'all should check that. I'll find the video link and put it in the group. Yeah. But
I dust my feet off to you, sir. Yeah.
But one of the things I like that I do think is important, and I think would actually be helpful for you to kind of spell out because it connects a lot of the different figures in the book, is that for those who do engage in science, philosophy of science, those types of questions, and come to panentheism through that, because there are also those that begin in the experiential realm and then are looking for the language right to do it.
Sure. Those
of us that are, would prefer to read quantum physicist versus a medieval mystic, how was it you began to question kind of reductive scientific materialism on the terms of science and see a vision of philosophy where there's more there? And when you're explaining that to someone who hasn't gone through that journey or doesn't realize how many of those assumptions are in them, how do you explain that and open it up? Because I bet a lot of people, and I know this is true just from my podcast,
sure,
who are leaving fundamentalism and assume if you use your brain, it also means some version of mind-body dualism, and then you get rid of the spirit, some type of mechanistic determinism, some type of sensationalism when it goes to what you connect with in the world.
Sure.
And that's not necessary, or I would say persuasive when it goes to the science. Sure. But like, where does that conversation begin for you in your journey, and how do you try to describe that today?
Yeah, sure. So, okay. So when I discovered process thought, and again, you're right, I sort of took the world for granted. It's like, okay, this world somehow is evolving forward, genetic modifications and natural selection working in such a way so that survival becomes of utmost importance. I still struggled to see how it is that there could be an upward trend, or the questions that Whitehead raises surrounding novelty, right? So novelty is interesting because it's a philosophic problem in some sense. If there's something truly novel, then the past does not fully dictate what's going on. Coach Whitehead finds this in the very fundamental elements of existence below which you can't go. There's an element of novelty, an element of self-determination. So how then does evolution work? Process thought began to show me that possibility in the nature of things is problematic. And that science often, and this is just one example, science takes for granted the fact that we are emerging out of myriads of possibilities, right? That we ourselves, you and I, Tripp, are actualizations of a kind of possibility in the cosmos that we didn't envision. And that's interesting, right? Because most possibilities we do envision and then we work to bring them into being. The evolutionary process has been one of an upward trend, achieving incredible novel forms. Again, what the hell's a T-Rex? Like, what is going on? I mean, that's a very interesting question, but in some sense, the potentiality for these kinds of things was in the nature of things already, right? So science presupposes, of course, that potentiality and novelty is effective in the world, and process raises the question on a metaphysical level, what is the storehouse and efficacy of potentials?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that would be one. But in saying that the fundamental constituents of nature have a mode of freedom or a mode of novelty, Whitehead was also pushing against reductive materialism. His book, it's a must-read for everybody. Science in the Modern World takes materialism to task. Scientific materialism, the notion that what is fundamental in the nature of things are kind of like billiard balls, bumping around, being causally effective of one another, and being combined to build a world. But the problem is you're free, and you have values, and you have consciousness. How is it that you could come from a dead world? Again, process would critique a materialistic scheme. And I wouldn't just say Whitehead. There's a great book. It's called Quantum Questions by Ken Wilber. Okay, and he puts together various physicists who themselves speak against this type of reductive form. So I began to see that philosophy and science even would demand, in some sense, an emergent, a non-reductive way of understanding things. And that possibility and novelty as such are a problem to which Whitehead, at least, finds a solution in what he calls the primordial nature of God, that possibilities are in some sense noetic content of the divine mind. So these, and so I started to see what sort of answers and questions these process thought solves. And I began to see how say Dawkins, as entertaining as these guys are, I love Chris Hitchens, like he's hilarious. But it's based on a bygone metaphysic. We can't no longer say that the nature of things is ultimately vacuous and ultimately blobs of matter. Like physics doesn't allow us to say that anymore. So what is it? I mean, that's an interesting question. I mean, that would be one example, I guess.
Oh, no. I mean, I understand. But like the problem when two people that have read Whitehead as long as we have talk is you're just like, obviously, or
That's
just like,
sorry, everybody.
Or if you're just like, this is your wheelhouse. So let me try something. So I've been trying to figure out how to draw some of these distinctions, and there's a number of turning points when you start to look at the big cosmic story that I think the question of openness, possibility, spirit, something other than matter in motion with its collective constituents emerging leads. And like, some people ponder or have the big question that seizes them around origin, right? Like, and you can imagine in contemporary debates, there's debates around like, what happened before the Big Bang, and can something come from nothing, and all that kind of stuff. And
right.
And now, but the interesting thing, like to just draw a contrast, would be to go, there's some individuals, physicists, who, because of mathematical ambiguities and the Copenhagen understanding of quantum physics, and just think like quantum mechanics, will then argue that we'll develop the concept of the multiverse, right? And the multiverse is saying that all of the possibilities that are present in the mathematical modeling of our universe are genuine realities. And there are more possibilities that are splintering out with each decision. So there's another universe where in the middle of this conversation, both you and I are like, screw process. Like, you know what I like? Newton. Let's do some more Newton right now.
Let's do some more
Like,
Newton.
let's go back to billiard balls. Like, there's that version somewhere.
Sure.
And each possibility layers out. Well, you know, and part of what they do that for is to then relativize the mathematical modeling that shows that there's a growing complexity, diversity, and intensity to the cosmos over time, right? Like quantum fluctuation in vacuum, a couple dead stars, now you have this periodic table, and then you get in certain situations where that periodic table is in certain gravitational energy input, and liquid water is present, and life emerges all the way up to like we make eye contact while making love, shred guitar solos between Los Angeles and California, and have cosmic campfires on the internet. Awesome. Like you start to think of that whole story, and you line up what had to happen if this was the only universe, and it's nuts. And then you look at your mathematical model in physics and are like, well, what if every possibility exists? Then it had to happen somewhere. Sure. And so then you get like the multiverse. In the multiverse, there's nothing wrong with it conceptually, other than outside of our space-time, there are billions of other space-times where all these other things take place.
Right.
And it's a deflationary act when looking at our world. The other is to think that the possibilities are just that, possibilities that weren't actualized.
Right.
Right. And we're in a universe where there is this dynamic process, life, growth, complexity, and such. And it's not the product of chance, because that would be rather poor modeling, or we're the greatest Yahtzee of all time, which is, technically could be the case. Who knows? Sure. But when you are a materialist arguing against mind being the active, thriving agent in the universe, your physicist that is your friend is the one that says multiverse, and that just hardly makes sense to people. It so doesn't make sense to people. I have two friends that are physicists who are atheists who are like, yeah, that's stupid. Like
the multiverse
not because they want to believe in God, right?
Yeah.
It's just because they said the multiverse people aren't multiverse types because they're of their physics. It's because they want you to know you're wrong, Tripp.
Sure.
So does that help me? Like, I really find that to be a helpful one. So like you have like origin, you have the emergence of consciousness in whatever way that looks like. You have like the emergence of life in the story. Those kinds of questions, all you could kind of pinpoint contrast. But sure, to me, the multiverse thing is one where it's a nerdy scientific help to draw the contrast.
Oh, totally. In fact, look what I have next to me here. Speaking of that, Ian Barber, for those of you who don't know him, it's a brilliant book, Religion and Science, where among many things, he takes on the multiverse question. And I think it's important to that's an awesome question. But again, it depends on how do we think, and I guess we'll get back to the book here in a sec too. How do you define a universe? Is it the totality of everything that is? If that's the case, then by definition, there's only one, it would seem. But if it's separate space-times, okay, maybe there's multiple sort of notions. But it's, again, the question of multiverse arguably is not one of science per se, but one of metaphysics.
Yeah, right? That's what I guess I should have said that. Look, I just find that the contrast helpful. Like, or put it this way: how many times are you talking to someone who's had experiences in their own life that their implicit and unexamined metaphysical commitments leads them to dismiss?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's a great comment. Evaluate your metaphysics, friends. Wow. Well, sure. I mean, the anthropic phenomenon. Okay, this is the fancy term meaning. Again, these fundamental constituents, the strong and weak force, gravity and electromagnetism, being at such a level so that it seems at least that intelligent, conscious-based life is inevitable, right? Arguably. So that doesn't mean we have a totally anthropocentric worldview either. Okay, John Hott, for example, John F. Hott, great theologian, talks about the aesthetic cosmological principle. That there's something in the nature of things that seems to be about the achievement of value and the achievement of beauty, even excessive beauty. Like we could imagine the universe being far less beautiful. You know, even Steven Weinberg raises this question, like, why on earth should I look out my window and see like inordinately colored birds singing and chirping in such a way so that I'm in this moment appreciating it at an aesthetic value kind of beauty level? Something's going on. Whitehead says the universe is geared toward the production of beauty. What type of universe is that? How do we speak of its deepest nature? We're not exterior to it. We're very much a part of it. And then last comment. I think metaphors is helpful here too. For a long time, the Newtonian metaphor, Descartes certainly was one of mechanism. We were living in a big machine. Okay, we'll hear Rupert Sheldrake speak more about this in his chapter. What we've seen, though, in the 21st century is a demand that we shift our metaphors. The mechanistic, materialistic universe doesn't fit anymore. And that's
or computer ones. Computer, if you equate the human mind to a computer and data entry, that's like the hip way of doing reductive materialism.
Sure, and we see that a lot too. What I'd say, though, on a process scheme, and it's not just process, certainly, it's a more organic model. The universe is something that grows. Like the universe, as Alan Watts once said, okay, the universe peoples like an apple tree produces apples. Okay, so what does it mean that a universe has produced you? And can the nature of reality be anything less than the kind of creatures it's produced? Doesn't mean that the nature of reality is like you, but that in some sense, value, purpose, mind, intention has to be located in a nature of ultimacy.
Mm-hmm. So, all right. So we should answer questions.
All right. We'll switch gears. Yeah.
Well, I'm happy to get on as many times as people want us to talk. Y'all can all ask. There could even just be a select few that are like, y'all should just talk about Whitehead for an hour and a half. I'm happy to do that, but I don't want to not get to questions because Mike and Mike didn't. And I just want us to be better listeners than them. And I don't even know if they could see them all. But Omar has a question. Can the concept of a Christian God exist if there's a multiverse?
Okay, awesome question. So a year ago, I helped develop a class with Roland Faber, who's the chair of my dissertation. Okay, here's the title of the class. Religions and Exolife. Okay, what do we mean by that? Exoplanets. These are other planets, some of them Earth-like. In the last 30 years or so, we've discovered thousands of them. Part of that class was to see that asking questions about multiple worlds, even multiple universes, again, how you define it, is inherently a part of the Christian tradition. For a long time, even back into early roots of the patristic fathers, it wasn't necessarily an affront to Christian faith to say that there's other worlds in other universes. We all know what happened to poor Giordano Bruno, 1600. Okay, but here's one again who had a deeply spiritual vision, arguably a panentheistic vision with multiverses. Now, so I think these are the types of questions we have to come to terms with now for Christian faith. Again, for one understand says, or even C.S. Lewis did this certainly too, right? If God became incarnate in Jesus in a world that fell into sin, what if there's another world that didn't fall into sin? Did God not have to become incarnate in that world, or, you know? So I'd say it is consistent. And it's a part of the science religion discussion broadly, but it's a question that's been asked before and a part of the discussion of Christian faith. Absolutely.
I would say that the thing, there's a difference between answering the question as Omar asked it and then making the observation that for contemporary, especially public square conversations around religion and science, the multiverse is a conversation stopper that resists rethinking our metaphysical commitments and keeping our kind of materialist ones. That in the end, physics is the only tool necessary for explaining everything. And we are riding a very sophisticated wave of fan fiction on top of our genes. And yeah. Anyway, all right. Next one.
Sure.
I know this is such a small thing, But did you ever have a period where people expected you to pray before meals, Sunday school, etc., and you no longer believed prayer was talking to someone? That has been an awkward thing for me. Evan asked this question, and Evan, I think that you're going to get a large number of people that have had the weirdness.
Yeah, Evan, good question, man. Totally, of course. There's been lots of situations where I still feel awkward to pray in a sense. It's not because I don't pray. It's just that I understand prayer and one's orientation towards the world a little bit differently now. What's the purpose of it? I mean, and here's the thing. It's like there's another question as well. Like how do you introduce these ideas to a community, right? I think you can do it within that framework. So prayer, say in a panentheistic notion, is not so much about asking a being exterior to you to intervene somewhere, right? But nevertheless, if God is that which in some sense unites and is inclusive of and is in some way the ground of the unity of the world, then our thoughts and our intentions have an influence. Okay? I don't know how many of you would be open to some parapsychological phenomena. Again, that's interesting stuff. Sheldrake in particular has talked about that. David Griffin's written on it. I'm skeptical myself. But again, it depends on your metaphysics, depends on what the world will allow you, or your view of the cosmos allows you to posit. Intentions and words are significant. You may want to pray differently and use different language. Another question was, how do we refashion our hymns when it comes to panentheistic notion? Okay, great question. We're already doing that in a lot of ways. So I'd say it'd be about intention, okay, and how you choose to verbalize that intention when it comes to prayer is up to you. And you might choose to do it in a traditional way on behalf of those you're with, or a non-traditional way on behalf of a different community.
One of the ways I think about it, especially when I'm working if I'm teaching in a context of people that are going to be ministers, if it's MDiv or DMin classes,
yeah,
is as a process person, as a panentheist, if God is everywhere and in everyone, then prayer is making explicit what's implicit.
Nice.
And one of the most powerful things you can do as an individual spiritually is take ownership of what you give attention to.
Beautiful.
So the two examples he gave, before meals and Sunday school.
Sure.
One of the things I did when I was in a church that was less naturally open to my theological convictions than I was. Okay. Until Alicia and I had children, we served at churches that were more conservative than we would raise our children in, and then that switched. But I would be the one that takes the lead.
Sure.
One, because it's really weird if all of a sudden people start praying junk where you start crossing your fingers. And two, most people have the performance as necessary, but not the shifting of attention. Yeah. So how do you use the fact that people at Sunday school and before meals, I'm guessing with people that are used to it, how do you use that space to shift your attention to the God that's already with them, yeah, before them, and in the people near them? So before meals, like if you're shifting attention and using the space and time, the words or the silence, the breath or whatever you're using, to cultivate a shared sense of gratitude for a world that gives itself in death for the continued life of each other.
Yeah. Cruciform creation.
The giant network of people brought it. With kids, here's a great example. I will ask before a meal if we have time, and with 3 children, it's less frequently, but ask one of them, I was like, so where did the rice come from? And you hear the whole story, like the grocery store, someone put it there, blah, 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 blah. And whatever everyone else says, then you thank God for that entire network of people that brought the meal there, all the way down to the one that sowed the seeds and the ones that gave the seeds.
Sure.
And
you might work your way all the way back to the Big Bang there.
If maybe Elgin's only 10 now. I'm sure he'll do that at some point. But I mean, I just say that because it is a small thing that people expect to do it. But almost anyone that expects it isn't mad when it becomes more intentional. But what if it becomes more intentional where it's revelatory, not that we're begging God to show up,
Sure.
but that we're begging us as a community to attend to the God who's present.
Absolutely.
The other thing I would say is, and y'all should definitely just ask this question when Phil's on, and it came up in a couple of questions, is there is a tension. There are different types of panentheism, some that see God as a someone, and some that see God, namely, as not in any personal way.
Yeah.
So for those that don't see God in a personal way, I think for them, ultimate reality, the personification, all those kinds of things are means to an end, like an encounter where those no longer function. For those that see God as no less than personal,
Phil.
they see God's self-testimony in the history of the cosmos, where, like, what is the most complex, beautiful, intense experiences we have? They're interpersonal ones.
Yes.
So not God's a personal, like up there, out there, but whatever it means to be ultimate is no less complex and beautiful than our own subjectivity. It's greater because it's the source of all that. And so there are panentheistic expressions that don't have a mystic dissolving of second person language into the ground of being.
Sure.
But there are ones that insist that's necessary. So like that tension that Omar had a bit about it, Evan had a bit about it, and who was the other person? Well, shoot, the phone. Never mind.
Yeah.
The other person who had a question brought that up. Do you have anything to add to that? Because I just think it's important for people to realize like that's a live conversation among.
It totally is. Here, let me just give an example. Again, Dr. Faber, I did a directed study with him on panentheism maybe a year ago. I had an intention for it. This is what I'm going to do. I had panentheism for me a couple of years ago was more of a defined type of position, and he dropped a bomb on it. Right. So in other words, the literature he gave me, what I wrote as a research paper for him, it's actually on academia.edu, ambiguities in panentheism, is that this discussion is very diverse and very complex as to how we distinguish pantheism from panentheism from theism, right? On a popular level, these are very concrete positions, right? Pantheism is a monism. Theism is a dualism. And panentheism is a non-dualism, right? So in some sense, these different theological views live through each other, and they live in sort of creative tension. Now, you had said something earlier that sparked my memory. Right, so for example, in this book, I close my chapter, Returning to God After God, by trying, not so much speaking to my own journey, but trying to bring together some of the insights of the book and speak further to a panentheistic-like spirituality. Now, all these authors are not saying the same thing per se. Their journeys are super diverse. They've gotten there through wild, meandering, different experiences. And some of them, like Cynthia, for example, we'll see is not comfortable with the language of panentheism. Even the paradigm, she appears to view it as something rather static, in or out, right? These sort of prepositions don't work anymore, she says. What does she offer? Well, cosmotheandrism of Panikkar. Now, it's debatable whether that's going to gain any sort of standing either. But what's important is not necessarily the language, I'd say, and how you name particular things. But the kind of vision that emerges for these authors is not one that's exterior to. It's not one wherein the spiritual journey is about avoiding or leaving the world behind. In any way, it's about living more deeply into the world at hand, because this, in some sense, is where the reality of God is found. And whether they name things precisely the same or not, I mean, you'll see that they probably don't. But that many of them use the language of panentheism as a more adequate framework for conceiving divinity as inclusive, as immanent. So it's an ongoing discussion. Yes, it is. And the vocabulary, for me, just last comment, I like the language of panentheism. Theism, for example, just says God in the Greek. What panentheism adds to theism, what the pan-en adds to theism is an intimate conceptual framework. It gives you a locus wherein everything is going on, and out of which everything sort of comes. But again, people will disagree as to the language, and that's fine. We have to find a language, whether it's prayer or theology, that fits where we are in our journey, in fact.
All right, Andrew. Ken has a question. How would you articulate and unpack God after God in the back end of publishing this book? Is God being love a unifying theme in panentheism? How? Love the book. So
that's from Ken too. Ken, how you doing, man? We exchanged an email. Good to see you, or not see you, but good to be thinking with you.
There you go. But all right, so God after God, love, panentheism. Like, I guess this is a proleptic retrospective experience for those that haven't read the book all incompletely yet. But
well, so sure, yeah. Thanks, Ken. That's a great question.
Rest in peace, Lewis Ford.
Sure. Okay, this notion of returning to God after God. I happen to have Richard Kearney's book, Anatheism. Okay, subtitle is Returning to God After God. I like that concept a lot. And he talks about anatheism as not a position with respect to God, but as a kind of way, as a path that somebody walks, right? Away from one understanding through doubt and disenchantment, through rediscovery, through reaffirmation. We can speak of it as a way of thinking about God. Ways of thinking about God have certainly changed. I think of Marcus Borg, who influenced some of my thoughts on this book too, who always described his journey very personally. Away from supernatural theism through doubt and disbelief to panentheism is how he described it. And there's a couple diagrams in the final chapter that speak to this anatheistic notion. Okay, and so that's significant for me because process thought is inherently for me anatheistic. It attempts to bring together a notion of God that is relevant and conceivable in terms of our modern concerns, philosophical, theological, scientific. At a very practical level, people leave certain understandings of God and they return to others. Okay, T.S. Eliot says this, and after all our discovery, we'll have returned to the place we started and know it again for the first time. Know it differently. So for me personally, and the connecting love to panentheism is important here. Okay, the God of classical philosophical theism didn't really have a relationship with the world. That God loved the world was from the human perception, but not from the divine perception. Mm-hmm. What panentheism allows most of the time in most of its versions is an utterly relational metaphysics. And I don't know how to understand love without speaking about relationships, mutually effective relationships. Okay? You can't just love unilaterally, right? We can love God, but if God doesn't love back, I mean, that raises some interesting sort of questions. So I'd say the love question for panentheism is paramount, and panentheism arguably for a lot of people gives you a way of expressing a deeply love-based theology. Even to the extent that you suffer with the world. You suffer with your kids, Tripp, right? Who your son or daughter recently bit their tongue. I mean, you can't say, oh, it's no problem. You suffer with them. Okay, so the image of God here is related, it's loving, it's not impassible, which is a fancy way of saying that God isn't affected by the world. It's deeply passible. It's, omnipassible, right? To the extent that God feels the world as we feel it. That to me is a great way of beginning to think about what love entails and what it involves. Now we want to say more certainly, but maybe I hope that gives some direction, Ken.
Well, one of the comments that came in on Twitter was about the images of God that are panentheistic, which I think they just mean like the least panentheistic images of God. Yeah. And in like paying attention to the notion of love, actually, I mean, I find it helpful, especially when you're leaving concepts behind, right? So I mentioned earlier about I grew up in a Calvinist home. But if we ask questions, that was the answer. But nothing my parents did correlated with their theology. They were church planters, extremely loving, relationally invested, working towards justice, So my experience of church growing up was super positive.
Yeah.
Like, we started churches for people that didn't have communities that lift them up. We worked for creating space for people with HIV/AIDS in the 90s when they were getting kicked out of churches in North Carolina.
Okay.
My parents were part of starting the racial reconciliation interfaith group. Like, they my experience growing up, the church was nothing like their deity. Right.
Yeah.
And I remember putting the dots together after reading some books about Calvin's theology, where I'm like, if
disconnect.
yeah, I'm just like God's not even, you're nicer than your deity.
Yeah.
Like,
Sure.
if you asked most people that went to the churches I went to growing up, like, what does God want from you? Well, to really listen and care for all the people around you and your neighbor and try to love them the best you can. And when you gather together, you celebrate that love, call forth whatever that next step in each person and living a more deep, spiritual, loving existence, and really kind of invest yourself in the community so it becomes a more beautiful place to live, raise children, all that kind of stuff. And then you're like, and so what does that love look like for God? Well, he's also holy. And it kind of means he's a judgmental asset. So
set apart.
I'm going to set apart a large portion of people I made in my own image to demonstrate my holiness with eternal conscious torment. And so, like, one of the things I love about, like, this book or groups like this is, I think if you sign up for this, I think that there are plenty of people existing in churches where if you ask them their doctrine and then go like, what would full fidelity look like?
Wow.
Full fidelity to their doctrine will be less beautiful than what they're already doing. And what they're already doing is empowered and inspired by the God who is with them and within all the people they meet, family, neighbors, enemies, and all. And so when I start to think about panentheism, to me, it is a, sophisticated theology or whatever, but underneath it is theologians, mystics, thinkers, and stuff coming back to reconceive God in light of the actual lived experience of people whose lives are animated, inspired, and empowered by God.
Beautiful.
Like, if you think of the people that moved you most in your story, people have moved me most in mine. A lot of time there's this gap between the vision they're casting and the God they're speaking of.
Right.
And panentheism remedies that. Like, I make jokes on the podcast a lot. Like if you're a Christian, God should at least be as nice as Jesus. Like that. Like, if God is revealed,
we didn't see Jesus toss anyone into Gehenna outside of Jerusalem.
Right.
Or
right. I'm not saying God can't be more awesome. I'm just saying minimally viable concept of God for a Christian theologian says God has to at least be as nice as Jesus.
Totally.
And I know people that stress themselves out thinking that could be true. The other is, I think you should want your God to babysit if God was offering to babysit. In most versions of Christian theism, I wouldn't let God babysit. God's sitting there like, I'm omnipotent and shit. That your kid's walking in front of a car. I may or may not decide to exercise my potential power and save your child. You suck as a babysitter, God.
Right.
No wonder you let your kid take it on the cross.
Word. Well,
or even worse, Calvin's like, don't give him that permitted off ramp. Notice when speaking about omnipotent deities, I use masculine pronouns, but not otherwise. Don't give him that off ramp. Calvin's like, nah. There ain't no side things. God's in charge of everything. God's throwing that kid under there. Yeah. You just don't even have the perspective to see how awesome this is. And I remember the time I read enough Calvin that I realized that. And I went home from college to my dad and was like, Dad, you are not a Calvinist. He's like, I am. I love Jonathan Edwards. I was like, I don't know what the hell Jonathan Edwards said. I'm just
in the hands of an angry God.
Yeah. I'm just going to tell you ain't a Calvinist. If you are, you're the worst minister I've ever met. And I remember getting so mad. And then I lay in. And we argued about it for a couple of years. Eventually came around.
Yeah.
Now he's like, in charge of Richard Rohr's fan club.
Awesome.
And
Awesome.
I've told him that Richard Rohr's Trinity is not actually Trinitarian. Hashtag shade at Mike Morrell.
Oh, got to respond to
you
that,
like
Mike.
that? Okay, but that was two asides. But basically, what I was trying to do is like underneath a lot of this coming back to God, a lot of this visions of panentheism is really going, let our talk about God catch up to our actual experience about God. That you don't have to leave behind thinking systematically, faithfully, critically, and all those things, but you also don't have to leave behind the very spaces you've encountered God deeply and the very places you've been faithful to God to be true to the doctrines and stuff that have moved you.
Beautifully put. Yeah, like, so 2 comments. I mean, what we do see in this book is the experiential dimension is given priority in a lot of ways. And this seems natural. You're in a whirlwind of experience constantly. And part of the philosophical theological show, and it does extend to philosophy and metaphysics too, not just there, theologically, is how do you reckon the ideas you've been given with your lived experience? So in some sense, I hear you saying, Tripp, is that if experience becomes the emphasized notion, like it should, then it should change our understandings of things, right? There's a pragmatic emphasis, right? So Calvin, right, on all determining God, determining the eggs you're going to eat for breakfast 2 weeks from now. And yet, nevertheless, you feel free in doing things. You can't help but live your life as if you are free. Okay, what about a determinist materialist metaphysics? We deny freedom. There is no free will. But nevertheless, you can't help but live your life as if you were free under that assumption. So what I see here, theologically, philosophically, is that there's a pragmatic test in a way. Okay, so if your theory cannot fit into your practice, then your theory requires revision, whether it's theological or philosophical or metaphysics, right? Because the practice is where it's at. Now, Mike talked about having mystical type experience. I can't say I've had a mystical experience. The closest I had to a mystical experience where I wept was a DJ Tiesto concert in San Diego. And let me tell you, that was awesome. But again, I wouldn't say it was mystical per se, but it was musical. If God's in music too, then how do we think about that? But what I love about panentheism too, it orients yourself to experience the world differently. How do you experience the world? This is an interesting question. I don't think we think about it a lot. We're busy speeding around in our cars, to and fro, taking our kids to hospitals. How do you experience the world? To me, I experience it very meaningfully. It's full of value. Although it's full of struggle and challenge, I find beauty emerging. And that's an interesting world. It could have been different. So why is it the way it is? And what does your experience give testimony to in your life? And does your doctrine of God fit with that? A long way of saying, I agree.
All right. Well, Omar asked this question twice, so we'll do this. I was just reminded that we've been talking a while.
This is true. Is it time?
I'm guessing. No, I'm guessing that one of the children have woken up.
Oh,
so you want to know? This is a crazy aside. So in the last 2 weeks, my son, who fell backwards in a little kiddie chair, bit through his mouth, had 2 tongue surgeries. So he's like all the stitches came out both times. Our house is flooded twice. And we're currently not in our house. I'm at my dad's house because they're coming back again tomorrow. Alicia got some health issue that she has to lay in bed for another week, like half the day at least. And and then Elgin hurt himself playing football, but whatever.
So
it's like semi-legitimate. So my parental unit duties have gone up, and next week we have a scheduled with a specialist surgery for that tongue. So all I know is if Haven ever gives me crap for his tongue, I'm gonna be like, nah, I paid 3 times for you to go get your tongue fixed.
Yeah, so careful where you put that tongue, young man.
Yeah, he's got to learn to be a talker. Yeah. Anyway, so I was told one more question on text message. She's like,
Okay.
look, y'all been talking an hour and a half. You're going to help put your kids to bed.
I'm sorry. We've been having a lot of fun here, friends.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm just glad she didn't blow up the comments.
I see. I see.
Because we're at grandparents' house, they're not sleeping well, which I understand. Oh, the complete aside, if any of you, I got a message today. I have like 3 or 4 more sets of tickets to go see First Man
Ooh.
in the next 2 weeks. If anyone wants a pair of tickets, you can use it anywhere Fandango uses it. I did a favor for someone, and they offered me a bunch of tickets to give to podcast listeners as like treats. So if you want them, just message me. Your email address, I'll send it to you. First Man, it's like, the story of going the first man on the moon.
Yep.
And it's really good. Like, I mean, if you like the cosmic part of Cosmic Campfire, you'd probably like it. And I messaged the homebrew group earlier today, and then I still had 3 sets left. So if
We
a
got book
Cosmic
giveaways. We got ticket giveaways.
we're doing a book giveaway. Yeah. Well, I saw them. I tweeted about it a while ago, and then do you want to watch the screener? Oh yeah. Then I watched it. I was like, this is awesome. I love moon shit. Going to Mars. I can't wait for the Mars show to come. No, it's space. Any space thing.
Yeah.
I have no interest in leaving our planet. I like the conceptual part.
Okay.
It's like
Right.
science.
Sure.
Like after you do all the AP classes and miss all the science and math classes through college, and then you get into religion and science, I take all the MIT open courses for the not science people. I want to know all the ideas.
Oh yeah, Mars. I mean, these are great questions.
Yeah,
It's a fun time to be alive. I mean, think of it. Again, 13.8 billion years of churning, developing cosmos, and you're alive at this point.
Dude, I just watched the first episode of the Mars Show, new season on National Geographic. It starts in November, and my son's very committed to promoting the show.
Awesome.
Like, he loves it. Well, so I got sent the new one. We get done with the new season. It's okay. I don't know if you've seen the first season, but
I haven't.
like going to Mars, setting everything up in there. Second season, this multinational government group goes first. Well, then a private business goes, and it's like, there ain't no laws on Mars now. This is a different planet. And so you have like capitalism versus the multi-nation state peacekeeping side, all trying to do Mars at the same time.
Wowzers.
And yeah, it's great. And they made a board game where you pick one of the teams that are doing it. And Elgin and I have been playing it. That's a large side, but I'm pumped about the new Mars show.
Go see it, everybody. Yeah,
we watched the first episode. Here's what Elgin asked me after it. He looked at me. He goes, if God knew we were going to have to be a multi-planet species, why did he give us such poor biological infrastructure that will keep setting us to be tribal once we're outside the context and limitations
he used
of
just
our
that
social
language.
structure?
Yeah.
And I was like, what? He sent to me as a text message. And so I'm like, one, what 10-year-old sends that text message to their dad? And two,
a philosopher to be. That's who.
When Phil spent the night at our house a couple months ago when he was in North Carolina, and Elgin heard Phil's coming, and he's like, well, I have a question for him. I'm going to stay up till he gets here. And I'm like, Philip Clayton, he's in the book. He edited it with Andrew. And he was my dissertation advisor. He's Andrew's. He gets there. It's like 10:30. I thought Elgin's asleep. Elgin turns his lights on, gets out, comes out. And I was like, oh, Elgin. I was like, Phil, he said he has a question for you. What are you going to ask me? And he looks at Phil and he goes, how do we know that we're not just a dream in God's head or a computer simulation?
These are questions of physics today.
I know. Elgin asked him this, and Phil, this is a high-quality parenting move. And I was like, I'm going to have to use that. He goes, Elgin, if you get up before I leave in the morning, I'll give you my answer. But I need you to think of 3 things that would be different about your experience as Elgin. if you were just a simulation or a thought in the mind of God.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
And Elgin's like, all right. And he goes to bed. I wake up at 6:15, and I don't know what the hell him and Phil have been talking about in the room. But on the way to school, he's like, yeah, Phil's smarter than you, Dan.
That's awesome.
Anyway, Omar's question.
Yes, back to the questions, right?
So you grew up in a more evangelical environment, and he wants to know, how do you introduce a panentheistic, a more progressive view of God into an evangelical situation?
Sure.
And especially when you think of evangelicals in this time, I don't know what triggered them off, but they're getting more angrier and stuff. But like, if you aren't trying to challenge the framework, and a direct assault, I don't know, probably get yourself fired or excommunicated from your family. What are the conversation points? Like, how do you begin that to open that up?
Yeah, sure. Okay, great question. I'm not sure all evangelicals would reject panentheism, first off, right? So there's an interesting spectrum, even if you look up panentheism on say, YouTube, of different positions within Christian faith, a pool of Christian faith, holding to panentheistic frames. I've done this. Okay, I mentioned that after my MA, I spent 2 years, I didn't mention this, but I said I returned back to high school, right? I returned back to high school after my master's work. I taught at the same high school I went to as an instructor of theology, systematic theology, world philosophies, and biblical studies. It's the same high school that I grew up in. I saw myself literally sitting in my classroom as like, that little dude in the back. Okay, what do you do though? How do you introduce these things? One, show them that it's not so foreign to their worldview. You can offer a biblically based panentheism in various ways. You can utilize and you can bring these conversations up within the framework of evangelicalism. You can, again, quote Paul. You can talk about a cosmic Christ in whom and through whom all of creation is subsumed. You can use, as Rabbi Bradley Artson does, he has an essay, it's the second to last essay in the book. You can use beautiful images from the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, which convey a different understanding of God, right? A whole universe singing with the breath of God. You can speak about the Logos, right? Logos Christology in some way. So I would say you introduce the ideas based upon the foundations that aren't leaving from that framework, right? And you can do that. You can do that through various scriptures, but you can certainly do it through the Bible. It's not all that clear that God is up there and out there, say in some of the New Testament writings. And again, the Bible gives a whole host of different understandings of God. So when people say the biblical God, it doesn't mean anything. I don't know what it means. Like, which understanding? Okay, we're talking about a library of literature. So
it just is signaling which sacred text they're going to quote half a verse from.
Which sacred text?
Yeah, like when people say the biblical God, what they mean is, when I get done telling you a different opinion, I'm going to footnote the Bible.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Me 3:16. No. So again, you can do it strategically, and again, you don't have to be a wolf in sheep's clothing. I didn't enter my high school wanting to deconstruct worldviews. I entered the high school as a teacher, wanting to help these kids think through some of the biggest issues of life. These are questions of God and Christianity and how best do we live. And it wasn't just about regurgitating everything they've been told. Now, that ruffled a lot of feathers. I got some nasty emails, particularly about whether Genesis is literal or not, or hell is eternal conscious torment. But you can work strategically from the framework you're in. And you can utilize biblical models in ways that are novel and new. And that's what people are doing all the time. Polkinghorne, physicists like Paul Davies, to the extent that he embraces some religious inclination. Keith Ward, who's in the book, all of them use the Bible in such a way to support a robust notion of God that's inclusive and panentheistic. And you can do that.
So this is more strategic than that, though that's a better answer. But when I guest speak in evangelical places, or Pentecostal charismatic,
how do you get to these places?
No, their ministers listen. They don't. Their congregants don't.
Oh, let's see. That's the issue. Okay.
And when they introduce me, they don't talk about the podcast. They talk about he grew up in a Baptist church planter's home.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he's and then he went to the West Coast for a period of ministry. But whatever they have to say is fine with me. I don't care.
Sure.
Here's my tactic is I start talking about how there is a fiery evangelical strand of militant materialism in our culture. And I'm not talking about the kind that just wants you to buy stuff, because socialism is more scary to evangelicals than evolutionary panentheism.
Right.
But, we don't have to do that. Like, I'm not going to tell them that Santa wasn't white. You know what I mean?
Sure.
But you draw these contrasts where you're pushing back against, like, Richard Dawkins and company. And then you're quoting Bible things that Andrew's talking about, where it's like, God's like, I changed my mind, I repent, or I suffered with you, or I don't know what's going to happen, but here's what I want. Use the living, life-giving God's the language I'll say. Yeah. And I'll do I'll basically take open theist version of the Bible and process critiques of the new atheists, where once you say new atheists, they know I don't agree with them. You then do the Bible stuff, and they're like, that's right, Tripp. Why? Because overwhelming majority of them live in open and relational spirituality.
See, that's and now we're back to living again.
Yeah. You know that you have them if they pray, they live their life, and they're thinking God's with them and trying to help them love better and receive. Do you try to receive more love and give more love with others? Then you end with theological affirmations that they would not have been uncomfortable with at the beginning. But because you're like, oh, the guest preacher, he has a PhD. He's not one of those atheist types.
Yeah.
Oh, he's just quoting the Bible. The Bible resonates with my spirituality. And then you say, then what does this mean? Yeah. For too long, we've had Christian theologians think that the most true thing about you is that you bear original sin because of Adam and Eve and a sin in the garden. But we know. I mean, okay, I know this sounds like a shock, but it's not going to shock y'all. Y'all are biblical Christians. But what's the most true thing about the prodigal son and his older brother? Who his dad is. Right? So the most true thing about you is whose you are. And was the father of the son, whether he knew it or not? Yes. Was he giving all he had to the older brother, whether he recognized it or not? Yes. So what we have are not distances between us, God, the world, and our family and friends and neighbors and enemies around us. What we have are our own barriers we put between that and the divine embrace. And so what I ask us to do is to put on the shoes that the Father gave the Son, put on the robe, put on the ring, and go to the party. Because God's the one that throws parties when everyone realizes the most true thing about them, that they're known and loved completely by God. Because Beautiful. God's the one who searches until they're found. And they're just like, yeah. But if I got up at the beginning, and we're talking like at a Calvinist church, I mean, it's just worked so many times. But if you begin where their tribal antagonisms are affirmed, right? Like some people are right and some people are wrong. But what you're trying to do is to go like, what's wrong about those people isn't their thoughts about your religion. It's actually their metaphysical commitments, because it will short circuit beautiful theology, right? Then you go to the Bible and it's like, that's not the metaphysics there. And you do that whole like Whitehead bit on we got a story in search of a metaphysic. Then you like go back to those questions from the beginning, and then it sends you as Christians are the older brother who were sitting there not embracing all that's given, And for those whose materialistic thing that's closed you off, you want to know, can you return? Can you get back to God? Can you even squeeze the sacred out of this existence once you've spoiled it and left away? And the trick is that you can come to find God in everyone and everywhere. And the most radical statement is that was always already true.
Word.
And so that you can see that I don't currently work at a church, and I
are you going to give an altar call now, or
no? I haven't preached for 3 weeks, so it just comes out.
Well, so I don't know how much time we have, but one thing I hear from that too is that to this question, maybe you don't explicitly have to introduce this new way of seeing things. All you have to do is encourage them to become thinkers for themselves, to see that what they think is true is actually not the way things are, right? So, I was always baffled by the fact that many of my co-religionists in my upbringing, even now I talk to them, I work at the coffee shop nearby every day, I'm talking theology, are often convinced of what the Bible is before they've ever read it. And that seems so interesting and backwards to me, So often all you have to do is encourage them, no, seriously read the Bible, sit down and open it. Or get one of some dude with a deep voice that just reads Genesis through Revelation. I did that 2 summers, twice while painting houses. It blew my mind. Okay, it also raised questions though. When you really begin to read your scripture, it's gonna mess you up. It did for me because it started to raise all sorts of questions like, whoa, wait a minute, Jesus never said this or that. But why was I told this? Part of it is having the courage to make your faith your own. It's not worthwhile to simply hold something because you're brought up that way. Okay, inevitably, all of us do that. Okay, but the deconstructive phase can often be healthy, and reading and taking faith seriously, making it your own, might usher you into times of difficulty. Okay, but that's a part of being one who takes these type of questions seriously. So when I returned to teach, day in and day out, we were thinking on these levels. And those are the kind of things I'd say. It's like, listen, in the end, you have to come up with the way you view the world in some sense. You can't just have your mom or dad think it for you.
Mm-hmm. I do think that's important. If you lead with new ideas in an expression of religion that is so formed by the Enlightenment that ideas are determinative of their validity, then you can get cut off. But if you actually believe God is found in everyone and everywhere, then your primary job is that indirect form of communication in leading them to trust that experience, that encounter, that community of the divine.
Yeah.
That's more true than the concepts they have in their head. And the concepts we have in our head are often defense mechanisms in our spiritual journey from embracing a greater depth. And I say that as someone who professionally loves their ideas in their head. And I am confident that half of what I'm committed to now, I won't be committed to in 10 years. And that scares me because, I'll still be paying off the debt.
Oh, believe me.
For my degrees for now. So
you cannot serve both God and money. In other words, you go to theology school, you're not going to have any money.
Well, in one of the things you say in your conclusion, which I thought I'd read, and then you can conclude this in whatever way you want.
Sure.
Is you say that for many today, the spiritual journey has led to a shift in orientation toward a divine reality they actually inhabit, one which both includes them and is immanent within them. This, anyway, is one of the key messages arising from all the diverse narratives in this volume. So as a group of 2,000 or so people who are hanging out on the internet, reading this book, and then going to meet some really cool people as you go through it, how would you give that invitation to getting to encounter the book this way? Is a shift from the an orientation toward divine reality to one they inhabit that is that inclusive?
Yeah. As a concluding comment? Is that, sure.
Yeah, basically, it was a really cool quote. I
Yeah,
was going to talk more about it, so I thought I'd read it and let you say whatever you wanted. So
sure.
it seemed broad enough to include anything,
Totally, totally.
but make you anticipate as a participant getting to that last chapter because everything around it's pretty cool. It's a
Totally,
looper,
totally.
you could say.
Sure. Well, yeah, and I hope you all do get to the final chapter and let me know what you think. And see if it isn't a kind of vision that re-enchants you in a certain way. Um, One that orients yourself towards the world in a way that is more than simply human. Uh, One in which you can find the subtlest, the smallest, the most minutest of experiences of beauty in the world significant on a divine and theological level. You may not accept or wake up one day and say, panentheism is the language I need. You may find that atheism, theism, panentheism are inadequate terms. My hope and my desire is that you'd find re-enchantment in this volume. You'd find that there is a way of returning to God after God. And perhaps it's not a one return. Maybe you keep returning back and back. And that's in some sense what the theological or spiritual journey is, continual refinements of our ideas based on our experience. I hope the book challenges you. I hope it opens up new vistas. And I hope you'll stay in contact with me and continue the conversation. So I'm really humbled to be a part of this whole group. And Tripp, I thank you too for including me in the book. And let's continue journeying forward and see what happens. So I'll end it there.
All right. So a couple things is, one, we're going to be reading the book. We're going to go in order. The live sessions are going to be different. Two, I know a number of people that join the group that are Jewish. Yeah. So if you could message me so that when Brad Artson's on, there might be a chance for us to coordinate it where then you can pop up on the screen and I talk, do the video chat for the Q&A part. I don't know. I normally have been good at running Zoom, but today it got mad at me. So I can't guarantee I will succeed. But I do think it would be really cool because one of you suggested it. So it wasn't even my idea.
It's a great idea. Yeah.
Now that I've heard it, I'm going to claim it and repurpose your idea as an invitation to any of those that, or we could say, are religiously centered Jewish. I think that was the line. Whoever it was that messaged me, it was said, if I had to pick a religious center, it'd be Jewish. But I'm kind of I'm a flexitarian. Though none of their options were Christian. It was like, I'm Jewish with a little Buddhist side, and whatever. But Brad was super pumped about this, and his response was, we'll find out what would be a really good time. Here's the person that runs my schedule, because he's in charge of like old seminary and stuff. Yeah. And if you hear from the people that want to most engage me personally, let me try to schedule that time with them. And I was like, no wonder you're like the Jewish John Cobb, like one of the nicest people. John said he's going to come join at the end of the class.
Isn't he in China or Korea? I forget.
Yeah, he just got back, and then he has like a travel trip. But then he said, when would you want me to do it? And I was like at the end. I mean, this is Tripp's bias. I want JC, John Cobb, to join at the end because I mostly just want him to witness to the mics on behalf of Jesus and or Alfred North Whitehead. And
I thought, oh, wait. Oh, God. Just kidding.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and then, anyway, of the two, both of them had things to the group because they really wanted to make sure they engage. And then we're scheduling the others and stuff. But the other thing I was going to say is, if you come across words or concepts that you're reading and you're like, I don't know, then just share it with Andrew or I, and we can either just make videos in the group talking about it, or he and I can get back on, or if it's connected to a particular person, I'll ask them, because one, it's almost impossible 10 years into the academy to remember what it's like not being in it.
It's probably.
But these are stories of people who, when you read their stories, you're like, yeah, I get half your story. And then you start saying stuff where I'm like, I don't know that many syllables and words regularly, but they've been in the academy even longer. And so one of the things we want to do in facilitating this is really help all the translation part that's there. Because like super awesome grandparents, the memoirs really share to people that are younger stories that people have been through the stuff they're going through and are processed it, moved through it, and expressed things on the other side in different ways. So anything we can help enliven, open up, we're down to do. Along with an extra live session on the religious and spiritual benefits of Whitehead's metaphysics. That's also, I'm a process evangelist.
This is awesome. Yeah, I think all the listeners, I think you guys really benefit in a lot of ways from hearing, and hopefully we can have some of the contributors on, as you say, and throw questions at them and parse away some of the sinews of their journey, right? And I would encourage you guys too to hang in there, even though some of the chapters have intellectual content, it's within that personal narrative backdrop. So I'd keep that in mind. I'd hope you think about your own journey on the way as well. And remember that what they offer you can perhaps inaugurate different perspectives in your life.
Yeah, and I'm just super pumped that all of y'all are getting to read people I've been friends with and they've never attempted to write anything that a normal person would ever want to read. So Andrew and Phil should get super claps for this book. I'm looking forward to everything that happens. And
last comment, Keith Ward's in his 80 now. He said never in his life has he written a personal essay like that. I was like, that's hard for me to believe.
Dude, Keith Ward, okay. Keith is joining. He was one of the other people. He was like, well, if I pick a weird time, would people not in the continent of North America get to join more? And I was like, whatever, I stay up late. Like, I can get up early, but
I'll get up
as long as it ain't while my children are awake. Sure. And he was like, I said, I just want you to know, I've had you on Homebrewed multiple times. I never knew that avoiding heat and humidity led you to the Lord.
That's right, in Yemen. Oh my goodness, that's a great story. It's a great story.
Ed wants to know what's wrong with intellectual content. There's nothing wrong, Ed.
Of course.
I know people join this that are not just on the homebrewed side of things, which tends to have long form conversations with academics that have never thought of editing themselves, but some that come out of more contemplative questions or more that are just now leaving situations that are less open to significant intense thought. And I just want, if there are words or questions that come up, to give them the definitions or help them think about it, because honestly, that's the primary thing that happens in graduate school, is that you learn ideas you already thought about, have fancy words, so then it's shorthand so you can connect more dots. That's the big part. And so most of you can think about anything any intellectual thinks about. The key is learning which chess pieces go where so you can play the game. And
that's true. It's true.
Now, it's different when you leave the humanities.
Well, how can a human leave the humanities?
It's a good question. But I have met people that are essentially a brain on
Well, wait till you get to or Elia Delio's chapter. Cyborgs are on the horizon, friends.
Oh, I know. All right,
Tripp. So I'm gonna stop recording here.
Oh yeah, and we're gonna wave bye to everybody on the interwebs.
Thanks, everybody. Be in contact.
Oh, and Rob said he's been Googling terms the whole time. Send us the Google terms.
Awesome.
Because I'm always down to substitute as your theological Google. And until then, smoochy boochies, peoples.
Cheers, y'all. Be in
What
touch.
coffee shop do you work at?
Oh, right. Sanctuary Coffee. Tripp, you'll like this. It's a coffee shop church
Oh, in what town's it in?
in Claremont. It's a mile from me right now. Worked
What?
there part-time as a theological barista.
Watch out.
So listen, yeah, those of you who are near Claremont, come hang out. Come to Sanctuary Coffee. I'll brew you something up. We'll talk about what matters most. And you might have a croissant too.
Ooh. All right. Peace.
Peace.
Send me the audio and video. Just send me the folder it's in.
I'll load it up right now and give it to you.
All right.